Well, there are two dangers to unity. One, the war ends suddenly, and everybody goes back to wanting to repair the damage done by economic war. The other is it lasts too long. People start saying the price for Ukraine is just too high. It's costing us too much. This is not, by the way, only a European problem. It's an American problem, too. The war began as a surprise. It began with thinking that, well, we're going to get very deeply involved. It's going extra innings. Unity is still there. It may stay, but if this goes for a couple of years, who knows? It's important to understand why Russia began this war and why it's so important to them, Putin's lovely personality notwithstanding. Russia has been invaded in the 20th century twice by the Germans. In the last invasion, they almost made it to Moscow. They didn't make it to Moscow because borders of the Soviet Union were so far west. Had they made it to Moscow, it would have been catastrophic. As it is, 27 million Russians died in that war. Right now, the border of Ukraine in the north is 263 miles from Moscow. A Russian national would say, I got to have that border further west. This can't be the case. Ukraine was never admitted to NATO because the West understood that that's kind of a lever they can't stand. The problem it became that Putin started looking at this and saying, look, the West is weak, it's divided. If I take Ukraine and change everything, now this campaign had been going on since 2000. Belarus had been essentially absorbed informally. Belarus was critical as a Western buffer. The Southern Caucasus had been, if not absorbed, certainly under Russian oversight. Recently, we've had Kazakhstan have peacekeepers put in. Ukraine was sort of the last incredibly important buffer. If Ukraine was in their hands, they did not have to fear invasion. And what they were afraid of, which is why they always talked about never letting them into NATO, was they were afraid that they would be admitted to NATO. The problem was that Ukraine had developed a national identity since then. And what was a minor matter from the Russian point of view and incomprehensible why the West couldn't just accept that, we're going to have return to this border because Ukraine was not consulted in the least and didn't want to be back under the Russian thing. They went into Ukraine thinking this was a slam dunk. This is the old Ukraine. They also felt, look, the West is not going to be concerned about this. This is not going to be something that really upsets the West. And part of this had to do with the fact that they misread the West, but also that the West constantly misrepresented themselves. The Americans, the Europeans, always kind of, particularly the Europeans, they were extremely flexible. They weren't worried about a war. They weren't about to join into a war. And so, as has the war sometimes, the offensive began and something stunning happened. And the stunning was not merely the assistance to the Ukrainians. The stunning was the economic war that was kicked off, which the Russians never expected. Kudrin, who handles financial affairs, says this has been devastating for them. It's going to take years for them to recover from it. So the economic guys want this to end, and the military guy has been sent in to fix it. Not easy. We don't know something crucial. We don't know what the Russian reserves are. Maybe some intelligence agency knows this, just how many men they can muster, how much equipment they can take. And we also don't understand the morale. Sending a low morale force into war is not a very promising thing. I'm certain every intelligence agency has a theory. My own view is we don't know this. Therefore, we don't know what's about to happen. We know that there's been a change of command. We know that this particular commander doesn't like to take orders. He's going to do it his way. And we know that he believes very strongly in counterpopulation operations. In other words, kill a lot of people. Kill them all, God will know his own. And this is the mother of that. He did that in Chechnya. He did that in Syria. And he's been sent in to do this. The real question becomes, does NATO come across the border? Because NATO also has something at stake now. If it lets Ukraine sink, the credibility of NATO among NATO members is badly hurt. What's the point of being a member of NATO if they won't come to my assistance? It's a reverse situation that NATO has to say what they can do. There's substantial support for intervention right now. Poland, which has built up strikingly, wants in. The Americans are heavily deployed there. The others, are cautious, but there is a strange conviction among them that if they have to go, they'll go. So we're facing two brinks. For example, chemical weapons are used in this conflict, which in the eyes of NATO is an unnecessary war, trivial war. Then why should we think it would be used elsewhere? If there is no response, then the Russians will read this, and they frequently misread us because of the signals we send. It's okay. So let's assume, for example, we have an uprising in Poland, randomly selected, and the Russians decide to invade. And Europe has to convince the Russians, above all else, that there are boundaries they can't cross. They never convinced them about Ukraine. Well, now as NATO members, and if the Russians come away with the idea that they can use chemical weapons and there's not going to be any military response, the Russians understand war and are prepared to wage it. If you're in a war and you don't know that you're going to win it, you probably want to negotiate. But the war we're talking about is not the war in Ukraine. It is the economic can that the U.S., and it was the U.S., opened up on Russia was something Russia never expected, such a devastating economic attack. It's had a devastating effect on the Russian economy, which was fairly weak before, but its effect can't be underestimated. You got to negotiate it without giving up on Ukraine, because now you're stuck with Ukraine. You can't lose Ukraine. You're going to try to stay there. You have to have some sort of asset that plays to the economic game. Not many of those around. Among the few is international trade, which also runs on the ocean. It's not just a financial matter. It runs through choke points. For example, Algeria ships a great deal of natural gas to Europe. There's a shortage of that. What if the Russians try to block that through naval power? The navies haven't been called in yet. Denmark Straits is a very important passageway. The Gulf of Mexico houses three of the most important ports in the United States. The Gulf of Mexico empties out into two narrow passages, one north of Cuba, one south of Cuba. The ability of their submarines to block those are substantial. The U.S. Navy is nothing to joke at. And if the Russian Navy wants to engage the U.S. Navy, they're quite ready to have a naval battle. If you're going to throw a Hail Mary, the Hail Mary is to create economic pain on the Americans and the Europeans. The way you can do that is to block the naval passageways and hope that you can outfight the U.S. Navy, which they're not going to be able to, or at least convince the Americans to negotiate. Now there's a basis for negotiating. You let up on me, I let up on you. And that's going to happen, but he can't simply bleed Russia. Putin can't bleed Russia economically while struggling for Ukraine. It's just not an equal fight. He's got to end that blockade somehow. We always look at the Ukrainian war as the key. There are two keys. And the bigger key for him at this point is growing into that blockade. This incredible ability of the United States to use the dollar as a weapon. So the first thing you have to do in that sense is simply convince the Russians there is no way they're going to win in Ukraine. I don't know you do that if you don't enter. Entering the country, you're going to have to take some risks here or concede. He didn't expect to be in this tough spot himself. It'd be very, very helpful if Putin retired or found himself extremely ill and another personality could take it over. Because at this point, Putin is simply not trusted. It could be negotiated fairly easily without his personality.